Story 1. The Ghost Driver of Hollow Bridge. It was a cold autumn night when Michael Turner, a long-haul truck driver, found himself on the desolate backroads of Hollow Bridge Pass. The highway was notorious among locals for its eerie silence, frequent accidents, and, most chillingly, the legend of the ghost driver. Michael had always dismissed ghost stories as nonsense, the kind truckers told to stay awake during long drives. But that night, as he drove his 18-wheeler through the fog-drenched road, he would come to regret his skepticism. Around midnight, the radio crackled with static before cutting off completely. Michael sighed and reached for the dial when his headlights caught something ahead, a lone car parked on the side of the road. The vehicle was an old, rusted muscle car, a model from the 1960s, with its hood slightly ajar as if abandoned. But as Michael passed it, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like someone, or something, was watching him. Then, in his side mirror, he saw it. The car's headlights flickered to life, its engine roared, and it peeled out onto the road, tailing him at an unnatural speed. Michael furrowed his brows. Maybe it was just some reckless teenager messing around? But as he increased his speed, so did the ghostly car, keeping an unnerving, perfect distance behind him. He could barely make out the driver, only a dark silhouette gripping the wheel. Michael pressed his foot down on the accelerator, his truck groaning as it picked up speed. But the car matched him effortlessly, weaving back and forth in his mirrors. Then, suddenly, it vanished. For a moment, silence. Just the low hum of his truck and the wind howling through the trees. Then, bang! A loud thud on the roof of his truck. His heart leaped into his throat. Something, or someone, was up there. A quick glance at the mirror revealed something even more horrifying. The muscle car was directly beside him now, driving without a driver. The steering wheel turned on its own, and in the front seat, a figure, shrouded in darkness, grinned at him with hollow, empty eyes. Panic surged through Michael as his truck swayed dangerously close to the edge of the bridge. He grabbed the wheel, trying to keep control. But then, the radio hissed back to life, and a distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't have ignored the warnings, driver." The voice was followed by laughter, cold, lifeless laughter. Michael slammed the brakes, tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. The ghostly car sped ahead, but instead of continuing down the road, it suddenly flipped into the air, spinning, twisting, before plummeting over the bridge's railing and into the abyss below. Michael sat there, gasping for breath, his hands trembling on the wheel. It was over. Or so he thought. As he stared ahead, the thick fog on the bridge began to clear, revealing a rusty warning sign barely hanging on by a thread. Below it, scrawled in red, were words that sent a chill down his spine. "Don't follow the ghost driver." His breath caught. He had heard stories, truckers claiming that if you followed the ghostly car over the bridge, you'd vanish just like it did, lost forever in the darkness below. He turned his truck around and sped away from Hollow Bridge, vowing never to take that route again. But as he reached the next town and parked at a gas station, a fellow driver approached him, his face pale. "You look like you saw a ghost, buddy," the man chuckled. Michael forced a weak smile. "You could say that." The man's expression darkened. "Don't tell me you saw him?" Michael hesitated. "The car. The driver. It—" The man cut him off, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's Royce Carter's car. He was a racer back in the 60s. Died right on Hollow Bridge during a high-speed chase. Crashed into the river below. They never found his body." Michael's stomach turned. The man clapped him on the shoulder. "You're lucky. Most folks who see him don't make it out." Michael shuddered. As he got back into his truck, he noticed something in his side mirror. A set of headlights, flickering on in the fog behind him. Story 2: The Dead House. In the heart of Raven's Shade, a small town with a history steeped in superstition, stood Blackwood Manor, a house that no one dared to call home. It was a grand Victorian estate with tall spires, intricate woodwork, and windows that seemed like eyes, staring soullessly at whoever passed by. For over a century, it remained untouched, abandoned, a tomb of cursed memories. Every family that had ever lived in Blackwood Manor had met the same fate. They all died inside its walls. Some were found mutilated, some vanished without a trace, and others, well, their deaths were so gruesome that the townsfolk refused to speak of them. No one knew why the house was cursed, only that it demanded souls. And now, after years of abandonment, a new family was moving in. Nathan Turner, his wife Emily, and their 2 children, Lucas, 12, and Sarah, 9, had just moved from the city, eager for a fresh start. Nathan had bought the house for almost nothing, despite its size and beauty. He didn't believe in ghost stories. The moment they stepped inside, however, a deep chill settled in their bones. The house smelled of mildew and something rotten, though no source of decay could be found. The walls bore strange, dark stains, and the grand chandelier above the entrance seemed to sway, though there was no breeze. Sarah was the first to speak. "I don't like it here, Daddy." Nathan forced a smile. "It's just old, sweetheart. We'll fix it up." But something in the air felt wrong. That night, as they settled in, the whispers began. Lucas woke up around midnight to a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It came from his closet. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then, tap, tap, tap. "Mom?" he called out. No response. He hesitated before getting up and slowly opening the closet door. Nothing. Just darkness. But as he turned back to his bed, he heard breathing. Right behind him. He spun around, but the closet was empty. His heart pounded as he slammed the door shut and crawled under his blanket, praying for morning. Across the hall, Sarah was whispering in her sleep. But she wasn't asleep. She was sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide and unfocused, whispering to someone who wasn't there. Emily found her and gently shook her. "Sarah? Wake up, honey!" Sarah blinked, confused. "What were you whispering about?" Emily asked. Sarah looked at her mother and smiled strangely. "The lady in the corner," she said. "She told me a secret." Emily's blood ran cold. "What secret, sweetheart?" Sarah's expression darkened. "She said we're all going to die here." The next morning, Emily went into town to buy groceries and decided to ask about the house. She found an elderly woman at the general store, her hands trembling as she bagged items. "You bought Blackwood Manor, didn't you?" the old woman asked. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Do you know anything about it?" The old woman's face turned pale. "It's not just haunted, dear. It's hungry." Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" The woman lowered her voice. "Every family that's lived there has died in the most awful ways. The first owners, the Blackwood family, were found slaughtered in their beds. The next family burned alive, though no fire was ever found. Another family, they all drowned in the bathtub at the same time. Nobody knows how." Emily's hands trembled. "Why? What causes it?" she asked. The woman hesitated before whispering. "The house doesn't want anyone to leave." That night, the Turner family was trapped inside their nightmares. Nathan dreamed of walking down the hallway, but the walls seemed to breathe. He turned a corner and saw Emily hanging from the ceiling, her eyes black and soulless. Lucas dreamed of shadows crawling out from his closet, whispering his name in voices that belonged to the dead. Sarah sat up in bed again, whispering. But this time, when Emily tried to wake her, Sarah's head snapped toward her violently, eyes wide and bloodshot. "The lady says it's time," Sarah said. Emily recoiled. "Time for what?" Sarah's lips stretched into a too-wide smile. "For the house to feed." At that moment, the lights in the house exploded. Nathan tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. "The windows!" Emily screamed. Lucas grabbed a chair and smashed it against the glass, but the window didn't break. Instead, it seemed to ripple, as if the house were made of something alive. Sarah giggled. "You can't leave," she whispered. "No one ever does." Then, the whispers in the walls became screams. The stairs twisted, stretching like the house was shifting its very bones. The walls bulged and pulsed, dark veins spreading through the wallpaper. And then, the shadows emerged. Dozens of horrific, grinning figures slithered from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the Turners. One reached out and grabbed Emily's arm. She screamed as her skin blackened where it touched her. Nathan yanked her away. "Upstairs!" he yelled. They ran, the house warping around them, doors shifting, hallways stretching endlessly. Sarah laughed as she skipped beside them. "It's okay, Daddy," she said sweetly. "We belong to the house now." They reached the attic, the only room that hadn't changed. Emily noticed something scratched into the floorboards. A single word. "Jump!" Nathan looked out the attic window. The ground seemed impossibly far, like the house had grown taller. But he knew. It was the only way out. Emily hesitated. "What if we don't survive the fall?" Nathan took her hand, looking at their terrified children. "If we stay, we die for sure." He grabbed Lucas first. "Cover your eyes, buddy." With a deep breath, he jumped. They fell through darkness. The house screamed. The next morning, Blackwood Manor was silent again. The Turners were gone. The front door, which had been sealed shut, creaked open slightly, as if letting out a satisfied sigh. A week later, a real estate agent placed a new, "For sale," sign on the lawn. By the end of the month, a young couple arrived, admiring the house. "This place is beautiful," the woman said. Her husband nodded. "Strange, though. It's been on the market for years. No one ever seems to stay." The front door slowly swung open on its own, inviting them in. The woman laughed. "Well, I guess it wants us to move in." As they stepped inside, the door shut behind them with a loud, final click, and the house whispered, "Welcome home." Story 3. The Thing on the Roof. James Carter had always been a rational man. A man of logic, routine, and reason. He lived alone in a quiet suburban house on the outskirts of town, where the nights were too silent, too empty. It was on a cold October night when it happened. James had been reading late into the night when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic dripping. At first, he thought it was the kitchen faucet. But as he listened closely, the sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from the roof. Drip, drip, drip. Frowning, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. A cold wind whispered through the trees as he aimed the light up at the roof. His breath caught in his throat. There, perched on the roof like a grotesque gargoyle, was a figure cloaked in darkness. Its long, bony limbs bent at unnatural angles, its eyes glowing like hot embers in the night. And beneath it, a man. A lifeless body draped over the tiles, motionless as the creature drank from a gaping wound in his throat. James's stomach turned as he saw thick streams of blood dripping from the corpse's open mouth, pooling onto the shingles before falling to the ground below. Drip, drip, drip. Then, suddenly, the creature's head snapped toward him. James froze. His flashlight trembled in his grip. The thing on the roof grinned, its mouth dripping with crimson, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. James stumbled backward. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The creature let out a low, inhuman chuckle. Then, it vanished. James's flashlight flickered. The roof was empty. The body was gone. The only sound was the wind in the trees. James stood there, heart hammering, staring at the empty rooftop, trying to convince himself that he hadn't just seen a monster drinking the blood of a dead man. He barely slept that night. The next morning, James forced himself outside. He expected to find something, a trace of blood, a torn piece of fabric, some proof that what he had seen was real. But there was nothing. No blood. No body. Not a single stain on the roof or the ground below. It was as if the night had swallowed all evidence of what had happened. James tried to tell himself it was a hallucination, a dream brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening. The wind howled outside, rustling the trees. The house creaked in protest against the cold. Then, tap, tap, tap. His blood turned to ice. It was coming from the ceiling. Something was up there. James swallowed hard. He forced himself to sit up, every instinct screaming at him to stay in bed, to pretend he heard nothing. But he had to know. Grabbing his flashlight, he crept outside once more. The night air was sharp against his skin as he aimed the beam upward. His breath caught in his throat. The creature was back, perched on the roof, staring directly at him. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, standing in the moonlight, was the man from last night. Only, he wasn't human anymore. His head hung at an unnatural angle, his eyes blank and hollow. His mouth twitched into a sickening grin, and James saw that his teeth had changed, becoming sharp and jagged, just like the thing beside him. James's heart pounded. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, in a voice that was both deep and hollow, it spoke. "You saw me!" James took a shaky step back. The man's dead eyes locked onto him. And then, in perfect unison with the creature, he grinned wider. "Now I see you!" James turned and ran inside, locking every door and window. James didn't sleep. He stayed up, clutching a knife, his ears straining for any sound. But the house was silent. Too silent. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., something changed. The air in the room grew thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. A cold whisper drifted from the ceiling. "Come outside, James." James squeezed his eyes shut. "Come see." A slow, rhythmic tapping began on the roof. Tap, tap, tap. James clutched the knife tighter. Then, the door unlocked. Click. The handle began to turn. James held his breath. The door creaked open. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted in the darkness, was the dead man. James screamed. The next morning, James's house stood silent and undisturbed. His neighbors noticed that his car was still in the driveway, but James was nowhere to be found. His house remained untouched for weeks. Eventually, police broke in. They found his flashlight on the floor, its battery long dead. The front door was wide open. And on the roof, there was no blood, no body, no sign that James Carter had ever existed.